All right, well, I'll go ahead and do my quick intro and then hand it off to the Pixo team so we can get started. So thank you for joining us for today's SBDC webinar, Web Accessibility 202 with the Pixo team. If you joined us for the 101 session, thank you for coming back to dive deeper into this topic. Just a few quick housekeeping things before we get started. You will receive a follow-up email later today with any resources that are shared throughout the session, a copy of the presentation, and a link to download a copy of the recording of today's session. So you can go back and listen to that again if you would like. You are also welcome to ask questions. Just drop those in the chat box here on the Zoom, and we will be monitoring that throughout the session. The Pixo team does a great job of answering them as we go, but also addressing them at the end if that's something that Landi needs to speak to directly. So I'll go ahead and hand it off to the Pixo team, and we can get started.
Thank you, Jordan. We are very excited and honored to be presenting on this topic today. Pixo is certainly very passionate about accessibility, which you will see in Landi's presentation. And if you didn't hear 101, there's a reason Landi is very passionate about this specifically as well. She is an excellent advocate for accessibility on the web. If you're not already familiar with Pixo, we are a software consultancy in Champaign-Urbana, and we create custom websites, software, and applications that address unique challenges and put people first. I'm Danielle, and I will be behind the scenes helping facilitate today, but Landi will be the main star of the event. I'm also going to pass it over to Jenna to introduce herself.
Hi everyone, I'm Jenna. I also work at Pixo. I'm going to be sharing some helpful links in the chat for you today as Landi presents. So keep an eye on the chat. As Jordan mentioned, we love getting questions and often answer them during the webinar. There will also be time at the end for Q&A. So as you have questions, be sure to note those and we'll answer them. We'll also be sharing those links in the follow-up email. So if you have any questions after we wrap up, our door is always open as well.
Wonderful. I will pass it over to Landi and get started on our topic today. And I will just say there's definitely way more we can dive into on accessibility, which you will share at the end. And they're excited to hear also what you're excited to hear more about so that we can think about what the next webinar about accessibility can be. So go ahead, take it away, Landi.
Hi, my name is Landi Najarro. I'm a lead software engineer at Pixo, and I've been here for 11 years. I'm passionate about building quality software, and I am a long-time advocate for accessibility. This is why I love what I do at Pixo, because we treat accessibility as a team sport. It's not an optional thing. It's baked into our projects from the beginning. And that's because when your website adheres to the standards for people with disabilities, it makes UX better for all. So I'm going to share my screen. Can everyone see my slides? All right.
Good.
This is Web Accessibility 202, Beyond Accessibility, making your website inclusive and better for all users. This webinar is for anyone who has a basic understanding of web accessibility and wants to take it to the next level. So web accessibility is the art of providing equal access and equal opportunity of web content to people with disabilities. This is what we're going to cover today. Why should you care? Designing with accessibility in mind, creating accessible content, levels of violations versus level of fixes, common violations, limitations of testing as a non-user of AT, which is assistive technology, and conclusions. So the goal here is to make your site as accessible as possible to create an equitable experience for all users, regardless of their abilities. Why should you care? When you don't make accessible software, you may miss opportunities to connect with a large number of people, which can be really important. People who you are unable to reach will look elsewhere to get their needs met. People with disabilities in your target audience may be unable to interact with elements on your site, or they may miss important information. And yes, there may be legal ramifications that could happen if you work in an industry that must comply with Section 508 accessibility requirements. Most likely those are higher ed, government, etc. So oftentimes when building a website, people save accessibility for last. Why is that the case? Well, a lot of people believe, and usually falsely, that only a small percentage of users have disabilities, so they focus on building the software to cater to the majority. There are about 1 billion people with disabilities on our planet today. And so people by disabilities are by far the largest minority group on the web. If we include temporary or situational impairments as well, that number increases significantly. This example is from Microsoft's toolkit, accessibility toolkit. This specifically is looking at a one-arm situation. So permanently, if you only have one arm, temporary, if you broke your arm, and situational, you're a new parent. So permanent disability, that number is 26,000. The temporary disability is 13 million, and situational is 8 million. So when you take all of this into account, that number grows exponentially. There are also non-visible disabilities that can affect how someone can navigate your website. So this data that we've collected or that we know about is only from people who report that they have a disability. The number in reality is probably even greater than we realize. This is not an exhaustive list, but here are some other disabilities that someone might have that would affect their ability to use your software. We usually think of accessibility as expanding inclusivity. What we don't realize is that when your site is not accessible, you are exclusionary, potentially leaving out a bunch of people who could be otherwise independent. Imagine a blind person. They can cook for themselves, walk around town, make purchases, bathe, feed themselves, etc. Then they go onto your website to buy plane tickets. They get all the way to the end where they need to input payment information, and the form is not accessible. Now this completely independent adult person needs to ask someone for help to complete their plane ticket purchase. In this situation, you've created disability by removing their ability to be independent. Regardless of legalities and audience, we should design our websites in ways that shouldn't take away from a user's independence. That goes into design. Designing with accessibility in mind. Let's talk about how to include more people when designing a website. So these graphics should look similar to the previous two slides. This is from Microsoft's Inclusive Design Toolkit, and they have a lot of good resources and exercises that will help you build empathy and find areas of improvement for your site. Here's an example exercise that I really like. You might have heard of persona-based user stories like, as a frequent flyer, I want to be able to filter search results by price so that I can find affordable flights. We can use these personas to plan our solutions or tasks that will fulfill that user story. Write down the steps that you need to complete that task, and then choose one of the spectrum cards here, which would be, touch, see, hear, speak, and whether it's permanent, temporary, or situational. And then re-walk through those steps. Does it still work for the new user? If not, what must you change or adapt to have a more complete and robust solution? So, universal versus inclusive versus accessible design. Accessibility is a subset of inclusivity. When we build an accessible website, we are building it for people with disabilities, but it also improves the overall user experience on your site for all users. Usually this means that if there's information that's only consumable by able-bodied users, think of like a video for hearing or sighted users, and then there has to be an adaptable alternative for non-able-bodied users. Think a video transcript or captions for hearing impaired users. As you can see, accessible design meets the needs of people with disabilities. Inclusive design considers a full range of human diversity and addresses all needs. But then we have universal design, which encompasses those other two. And it does not need adaptation at all. So an example would be a shampoo, conditioner, and other beauty products that look almost identical. So on the left, we have shampoo, conditioner, body wash, and bubble bath, but they all look exactly the same. If you can't see, how do you know which is which? Now, if you look at the example on the right, we have shampoo and rinse, which I don't know what rinse is. I imagine it's conditioner, but from a different place. So we can see that there are these raised tactile marks on these bottles. The square one is shampoo, and the 2 rows of lines is the rinse. That's it. It's not a huge change, but it makes a big difference to someone who can't see. A little caveat here is we do not have a universal standard for universal design. So there might be other companies that are also doing the same thing for their shampoo and conditioners, but they might not have the same tactile marks to differentiate between the two. So that's not a thing yet, but that's something that people are definitely interested in working toward. Next, I'm going to talk a little bit about accessible content. I am not a content strategist, so I can't necessarily help you make good content, but I can make you make sure that it's accessible. So the main two things would be headings and readability. So the heading should be organized like a paper, just like you would do in your high school literature class. Avoid abbreviations and jargon in headings. The first time that you do use an abbreviation, make sure that you use the expanded form of the abbreviation, followed by the abbreviation in parentheses. So like the ABS is anti-lock brakes, for example. It should be also organized by heading. So the header 1 is your page title, and then a 1 to 2 page summary of the contents. The header 2 should be the first subject supporting that header 1. The header 3 should be a subcategory of that first header 2, and so forth and so on. Also, content should be readable at an 8th grade reading level. There are a lot of different apps and websites that can check your site for readability. Our senior content strategist likes this app, Hemingway. It's free and it does a really good job also of suggesting changes. So this 0 uses of passive voice. That's great. There's one phrase that has a simpler alternative. 2 of 11 sentences are hard to read. 3 adverbs, abe for 2 or fewer. So that would really help you get your content into a readable state for 8th grade level. The other types of content that we have would be link text. Things that you should do or maybe avoid doing is using the click here or more, read more buttons. Make your link text unique. Having 2 URLs with the same link text can cause a violation. If you have the same link text and they're going to the same exact URL, that's not really a violation, that's redundancy, and that could be good. Like if you had text in the copy of your page and also in the navigation, for example. For email addresses and phone numbers, link to that email address or that phone number as the link text. For documents and files, include the file type, so like a PDF. Include the file size within the link text so that a user would know, okay, this is a 30 gigabyte PDF. Do I really want to download this or not? You should alert the user when you're opening new windows and navigating them away from your site. The best way to add that, indicate that it's opening in a new window or a new tab would be something like opens a new window or new tab. For images, you must include alt text, and think of alt text like a tweet. It should be succinct, but it should be accurate, accurately reporting what's going on in the image. So for guidance, you can ask, what message are we trying to convey with this image? Avoid phrases like image of or graphic of, because the image tag will already tell the screen reader that it is an image. If the image is purely decorative, then you want to use alt equals and just use an empty string. So that way assistive technology will just ignore that. For tables, make sure you're using proper headings. For media and downloads, you just need to create accessible media. And for video and audio, that might be captions, audio descriptions, text transcripts, or anything equivalent. We are going to provide resources on making YouTube videos accessible and making PDFs accessible as well. So one thing to keep in mind is when your code is no longer having any violations, the content will still be updated. Content is meant to be updated. So that must mean that you will have to monitor your site for new accessibility issues introduced by content creators. There will be times where code will also become outdated as WCAG standards change, but it's far less frequent than the violations you'll find from changing content. As I said before, the goal is to make your site accessible as possible to create an equitable experience for all users, regardless of their abilities. Bruce Lee once said, a goal is not always meant to be reached. It often serves simply as something to aim at. And that is exactly how I feel about accessibility. It's constantly changing. It's a moving target. So you have to be vigilant about being on top of auditing your site and making those fixes. So now we're going to talk about the severity of violations. If you design things universally, you can work toward being a one-size-fits-all to the greatest extent possible. But even with universal design, not everything is so straightforward. There are different levels of complexity in designing something universally. If you've already designed and built your website, even with universal design principles in mind, there may still be accessibility violations or usability bugs. These violations and bugs can have different levels of severity. Basically, we want to know what is the likely impact that this violation may have for web users with disabilities. So, every bug is not the same and doesn't require the same level of effort to fix. So an example blocker would be some users won't be able to access the main content, period, full stop. A critical violation would be some users won't be able to access some of your content. A moderate example would be some users will have some barriers to accessing some of your content. So not that they won't be able to access it, but it just isn't easy for them. And then minor, it can be a nuisance, but there's not any significant barriers for your users. So there is, again, no standard definition for what severity is, and some tools have come up with their own rating system. So this graphic on the right comes from an article on accessibleweb.com. And these concepts of blocker, critical, moderate, minor come from an article in usability.com that I'm going to discuss on the next slide. So yeah, how does one determine severity when there are no standards around this? One thing I want to mention is Section 508 makes it clear that all accessibility violations should be fixed. Even a single violation could bring a lawsuit. We won't always have the time or resources to fix every violation at once, so these concepts are just to help us prioritize what to address and when. This graphic is from the ADA Title3.com, and you can see that there was a huge increase of lawsuits up until about 2019. And then I don't know if this is because of the pandemic or what, but the lawsuits have started dropping, but you're still not completely risk-free. So it's still something that's very important and prevalent today. WCAG is very good at letting you know when a website has accessibility violations, but what it doesn't do is help you understand how inaccessible that violation is. Sites that have a few minor bugs are still generally pretty accessible, but whether or not something is a blocker, critical, moderate, or minor is all purely subjective. WCAG does not recognize any categorization for these violations, so each company has to determine the severity for themselves based on their own criteria, like the audience of who the website is for, the staff that's using the system. This can become complicated when you have an audit done with one company or tool, and they say your site is accessible, and then another company or tool does the same test on your site and they find a violation. It really becomes this manual evaluation at this point, like right versus wrong becomes unclear. So in those cases, I would always err on the side of caution, because if someone finds an error, it may be due to them having used the site in a way that I didn't anticipate or with a blocker I hadn't considered. So this idea of access barrier scores, the ABS system, is from a 2011 article in usability.com, and it's a proposal for categorizing accessibility violations. So barrier description. What is the barrier that a user with disabilities will be facing? Reference, which criteria does it relate to? Incidence, a measure of how frequently the use of a site's component does not meet the relevant accessibility requirements. This is not a raw measure of how often a guideline is not complied with, but rather like an estimation of how many times it appears on a page. It's kind of judged with a 5-point scoring system. So 0, no incidents or failure. A 1 is between like up to 25% of the time. A 2 is between 25 and 50% of the time. 3 is 50 and 75% of the time. And 4 is above 75%. So that's how they're measuring incidence. Severity is the likely impact the barrier might present for someone with a disability. And the remediation priority is using incidence and severity to decide what are we going to do first. So Pixo isn't using this exact system for rating, but we're doing very similar things. So we are using severity almost the same way as they're using remediation priority. If something is severe, we treat it as a priority, even if it does have a low incidence, though. So fixes, not one size fits all. There might be a small bug related to missing link text. It's fairly easy to add an ARIA label to the link to describe its purpose. This would be like a Band-Aid fix. When you can, you want to use semantic HTML to build your websites, but you can add additional accessibility properties like an ARIA label. That'd be like slapping a Band-Aid on. A large bug related to form fields not having proper HTML structure might be complicated to update the structure, and therefore you might have to update a lot of styles. In that case, you might have stitches, medical tape, staples, glue, or in some cases, like a really big surgery to get those fixed, and that might require a ton of costly changes. So, oops. Common violations and fixes. I'm going to share some examples of common violations at different severity levels. This graphic comes from the WebAIM Million report, which tests the accessibility of the top 1 million homepages as reported by Trinco. If you look, 96.4% of all the errors found between 2019 and 2024 fall into one of these 6 categories. There are some violations that are not listed in reports that affect a great number of websites as well, like keyboard navigability or focus states, no focus states to match hover states. But these 6 have been the most common over the last 5 years. So addressing just these few types of issues would significantly improve accessibility across the web. I'm going to show one example of each, about each, and then show how we fix them and how they fall into different severity categories. When I can, I use the Pixo website as an example. Trust that these are not actual violations on our site. I've just created the violations in the developer console so that I can capture examples. Pixo is constantly evaluating our own site to find and resolve accessibility issues. So the first one that we have is low contrast text. This is an example of a minor violation. You'll see that this graphic for one of our blog posts has dark blue text on a darker blue background. It doesn't have a ton of contrast. The background text lists the pixel values, and it's used just to add visual interest to the image. All of the values that are listed in that image that you can't read very well are also listed in the blog post below the image. The text on the image that says Pixel Values 2021 award winners is also the alt text of the image. So I decided that this one was minor because while it's not clear, it's not very easy to read that text, it doesn't prevent the users from getting that same exact information from the alt text and the body copy of the page. The next example is a moderate example. There are some barriers. This is a cookie policy opt-out link, and it's very, very hard to see this text that says, do not sell or share my personal information. I'm not even sure how well this is coming out over screen share, but I made this one moderate because it's not preventing users from accessing any of the content of the site. If you were using a screen reader, you'd still be able to hear that text. If you were in dark mode, you might be able to see that with a little more contrast. But even if it might not be a huge violation, I would say this is still morally questionable, making it hard for a user to opt out of sharing their data. So this is something that you might just want to address because we can do better than that. I have a third example for low contrast that could be critical. So here's an example of a legend to report performance issues. We have normal, issues, and outage. And this is only using color. It's the sole way to communicate something. To a non-colorblind user, that key on the left makes perfect sense. So does the key on the right, though. And the key on the right also has icons, and it would make sense to everybody regardless of their color perception. I made this a critical bug because some users won't be able to access some of your content. And this is what that would look like for users with different type of color blindness. So we have red blind, which is protanopia, green blind, which is deuteranopia. And you can see without the icons, it's pretty hard to differentiate between the different statuses here. But on the right, even with the different color blindness, it's much easier to understand at a glance what the statuses are telling you. If your entire site was about communicating outages, I would upgrade this to a blocker because that would mean some users won't be able to access your main content. And that's not good. So how do we fix low contrast? I recorded a little video of me fixing a low contrast violation, but I am also making these changes in the inspector, the developer console, just to show you how you would be making these changes. You would have to make the actual changes in your code base. So we can see this is very similar to that first example that I shared. We have dark blue text on a darker blue background right under this big white heading. So I'm not sure how well that's coming through on screen share either, but here is how I fix that. I go to a tool called Colorable, which we will share, and I'm just increasing the lightness of that text till I get really, really a good color that I like and that has a lot of contrast. Then I will inspect that text block, find the color, change it, and it still fits within our branding guidelines, and it's a lot easier to see. So that's an example of how you would fix it. You could use a tool like Colorable that will show you here is the contrast level, and then you can tweak those colors. The next example we have is missing alt text. This is a minor example. It's an image that is a link, but it doesn't have alt text. So an image missing alt text. If the link has a label, you know where the link will go, but you still won't know what that image is representing. It can be inferred, however, that it's related to whatever you're linking to, which is why this is minor. This could be, I don't know, a picture of a frog linking to the Pixo website. I don't know why we would do that. We probably wouldn't, but in that case, you wouldn't understand that this is a picture of a frog. It could be something more festive, like the Pixo logo with a little shamrock above it. And it's like, hey, this is a St. Patrick's version of the Pixo logo. And you would be missing out on that information if that was important information. So here's an example that would be a blocker. This is a graphic that shows available seats on an airplane. The graphic shows rows and seats on the plane, but there's no text alternative. The graphic is not interactive, and the form that you get to fill out is a free form. It's a text box. You don't get a list of available seats to choose from. So if you are someone who can't see, you have no idea what the correct input might look like. Is it A-1? Is it A1? Is A at the front of the plane or the rear of the plane? Is it a window seat or an aisle seat? How many seats are in a row? You could have good alt text that would have that data represented somehow, or you could have that data represented somewhere in the body copy. But a better design would be to include interactive seats that you can click on, or a drop down of here are the available seats instead of a free-form text box. So how do we fix missing alt text? I've recorded another video for Pixo website. So I'm using A-Inspector sidebar on the left for Firefox. You can see that it's finding that image violation and it's putting a red violation box over it. What I'm doing is I'm inspecting the element, finding the image, and then adding alt equals, and I describe the image. Two illustrated Pixonauts collaborate with sticky notes. I rerun the evaluation in A-Inspector on the left, and the violation went away. And that went by a little quick, so I'm going to go back to the, after I fix it, I hit rerun evaluation. It's now a pass, and that's how you would fix missing alt text. All right, the next big category is missing labels. So this is a minor example. Imagine a form that describes what it wants you to do. In that copy, it says, enter your email address below. But there is no label on the form field itself. You can infer from the description above that the field is for your email address. That's why it's minor. The information is still there. There's only one field. It can't be too confusing, but it's still not ideal. Here's a critical example. Serious barriers. Imagine a form with only placeholder values. When you tab to each field, that placeholder value goes away. A person with no or limited vision won't know what each field is for and would require assistance to fill it out. So how do we fix missing labels? Ideally, we would have an actual HTML label element above the field to explain what that is. But if you don't like that for aesthetic purposes, for example, you could use ARIA label, which you've seen us do similar with the alt text. So here's us fixing a form on the Pixo website that is only using placeholder value at the moment. So again, I'm using A inspector. I find the violation and it doesn't quite correctly highlight it, but as you can see, I find this class HS input mode email. Since I only have the one form field, I know it's referring to this form. So I inspect that form, I find it, and I edit it, and I add ARIA label equals email. And when I rerun it in A inspector, you see the violation goes away. It now passes. So again, really simple fix, not a lot of work to bring that to compliance. The next one is empty links and buttons. I grouped them together because it's the same exact fix for both of them. So minor, no significant barriers. Imagine a logo that links to the company's homepage. The logo has alt text, but the link has no link text. So this is the reverse of the very first example I showed you, where it was a link with link text, but the image had no alt text. Again, not a huge barrier because the computed accessible name comes from the image alt. You'll see accessible name is Pixo, and it comes from the alt text on that image tag. This is using the accessibility bookmarklets, by the way. The accessibility bookmarklets were created by myself and some other Pixonauts in collaboration with DRES at U of I, and that's the Disability and Resources and Educational Services organization at U of I. So the reason this is minor, by the way, is because we have that link text coming from the images alt, so you still know where that link is going. Here is one that could be a blocker. Imagine you have an e-commerce website with a navigation to your cart, your profile, etc. There's no alt text on any of these icons. Without link text as well, an assistive technology user won't know where those links are going. Some screen readers may read the href, which is on the anchor tag, the A tag, but that's horrible UX. It'll say https://www.amazon.com/cart/ maybe some big query string. It's just not good enough. Some assistive technology will skip empty links altogether, and that can prevent users from accessing a huge part of your site, like actually buying things. So if e-commerce is your thing and users can't understand where they're going when they get to your cart, that could be problematic. So what we would do, just like we did with the other ARIA label in the form, you would add ARIA label equals cart. ARIA label equals your account. So adding those ARIA label attributes will resolve the error with users not knowing where they're going. This, by the way, isn't how Amazon's site actually looks. I, again, in the inspector, removed some code to create this issue. So they actually do a very good job of adding alt text and labels. Their cart actually does have visible link text that says cart. So just didn't want you all to think that Amazon was doing a bad job with their website accessibility. So, all right. Lastly is the limitations. Oh, well, not lastly. There's one after that. Limitations. There's only so much that we as non-assistive technology users can do to identify and remove accessibility barriers. So disability is the most intersectional identity crossing all social, racial, gender, and economic lines. Accessibility is people-oriented, and even though our hearts are in the right place, we can at best take educated guesses about what accessibility decisions would improve the experience of a person with disabilities using our software. So this past year, I went to AXCON, which is given by DQ. They are some of the leaders of accessibility, and they've been doing this for, I think, like 25, 30 years or so. And one of the talks that I went to was by Kathy Martinez, VP of Global Disability Inclusion at Expedia Group. One of the things that she said was, I think that so often people have spoken for us or about us. The problem that she's alluding to here is they're not including us in these solutions. So these solutions don't often hit the mark. One of the best things that you can do is hire people with disabilities, and not just to do disability related work, but find out what they need to be set up for success. So usually people use the word accommodation to describe this, but everybody with or without disabilities gets accommodations. Even the coffee that we drink in the morning is an accommodation that helps our employees do their best work. So have people with disabilities included from the very beginning of your project could be very useful. Most companies realistically can't just hire hundreds of people with disabilities to get a better understanding of how their software can be improved for the accessible user experience. So hiring just one person doesn't give you a large enough data set to work with. There is a quote by a man named Dr. Stephen Shore. If you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. And that could be applied to any disability. As an example, let's ask ourselves, what does a screen reader user look like? It could be a 21-year-old college student who was blind since birth, who grew up around tech. It could be an 80-year-old person who lost their vision 2 years ago, or a 45-year-old who's losing their vision and enlarges the screen or zooms in. Each person here might have a drastically different experience than the next person. They won't struggle with the same things. So if only one of these people is struggling, is it really due to your software? That's a very difficult question to answer with such a small data set. So instead, you want to see trends that multiple people are struggling with an area of your site before you change it. Much the same way that you do A/B testing, you identify an area of your site that isn't having the desired impact, you plan a change, you release that change, and then you measure the new impact. It's an iterative process, which is why accessibility is not just one and done. Even with our best intentions, we don't understand what it's like to use assistive technology every day to navigate the world around us. When we don't understand the barriers, we can't always see them, and we end up with shallow solutions that don't help anyone, like Braille on a highway sign, or, oops, Braille on a piece of hot glass. Now, conclusions. When you understand the barriers that users with disabilities face, that's half the battle. Removing the barriers isn't that difficult. There are 3 different levels of empathy. There's cognitive, understanding someone else's way of thinking. There's compassionate empathy, connecting with someone else's experiences and wanting to help them. And there's emotional empathy, feeling the same emotions as someone else. Oftentimes, you're not going to have that emotional empathy, but we can at least have that compassionate empathy. We understand what they're going through and we want to help them. An example that I can have of where not seeing the barriers means you can't help them would be, imagine you're on an airplane and you're in first class. You're the first to board. You don't see the condition of the back of the plane or the economy class, and you can't empathize with their experience. It's a type of blindness as well. If we don't see the problem, we don't understand it's a problem. How can we fix the problem? Another thing to consider is the WCAG guidelines. They are meant to be used. There's not a lot of jargon, and it really helps you understand the barriers that a user with disabilities would have. It really helps you understand what the criteria is, and it even has a lot of examples on how to meet that success criteria. So when you can, I encourage you to look through those guidelines, especially if you're not meeting some of those guidelines somewhere. Look through them, go through the examples. It's very user-friendly. One of the things that I would like to do in the future, some things that I'd like to talk about would be keyboard only functionality, focus states, tables, tab panels, forms, and then search, filter, and pagination. So those are things that I've also seen a lot working in higher ed sites, for example. So I am also really interested to hear what type of things that you all would like to learn about and have us cover next. Lastly, here is a slide that includes some of the resources that I've used in this presentation, as well as some links for testing tools that you can use when evaluating and fixing your own site. So yeah, Pixo has been doing accessibility for a really long time. And we have a team that understands Section 508 compliance, the ADA, which is the Americans with Disability Act, and WCAG standards. And we can help identify and improve accessibility issues. Like I said before, we created the accessibility bookmarklets that help users see what accessibility features are on their site. It's not an evaluation tool, it's just a visualization tool. And if you need additional information or help bringing your site to compliance or testing it at all in the first place, we can do things like audits, recommendations for fixes. We can quote you for the actual fixes, depending on what your tech stack is. We can give you a list of tools, and we have usability testing experts. So just reach out to Danielle if you're interested in any of these services. And a big thank you to SBDC for setting up this webinar.
Thank you so much. I know there were some questions that came in the chat, so Jenna, I'll let you take that away.
Yeah, so Kurt had some really great questions in the chat. And I know one of them we talked about, Landi, when we ran through this presentation. It's about A Inspector only being for Mozilla
Yes.
for Firefox. So what are some of the
Yes.
other tools that you would recommend for other browsers?
So another good one is the Wave toolbar. It's available for Chrome, Safari, Firefox. It's, cross-browser, which is great. The reason that I use A-Inspector is because the same people that we collaborated with to make the bookmarklets also made A-Inspector and the FAE Functional Accessibility Evaluator tool that we use all the time. So I know that my results are going to be consistent across those three tools. But Wave, because it's also implemented by a different set of humans, might find different bugs than you would find on A-Inspector. But I just really like the quality of the feedback that we get from A-Inspector and how it links and has a lot of information to the WCAG guidelines, etc. But Wave is also very good.
Awesome. Kurt also asked, what screen read utility or other ADA tools do you use to replicate the experience of someone using specific ADA devices?
Okay, so the only tool that we really use at Pixo would be a screen reader. And that's because oftentimes, well, a screen reader and keyboard only. Because oftentimes when you can make your site keyboard accessible, a lot of assistive technology to your computer will look like a keyboard I/O. So if you can access everything with your keyboard, you can access it with a lot of different assistive technologies. I have talked to Drez in the past about partnering with them to have people that use different assistive technology devices come and test websites. And we have not kicked that off because they're very busy students. But that is something that we're interested in as well. We have software that we use for screen readers. Depending on operating system, the one that I used to use a long time ago when I was on Windows was NVDA, which is a free software, or at least there's a free trial for that software. And the reason that I like NVDA is because it does not do a lot of guesswork for you. So some tools are more sophisticated where they'll see some issues and kind of smooth over those issues and do some guesswork to get you where you need to be, which is great for the everyday user. But if you're trying to find bugs and improve bugs, using the less sophisticated tool will reveal more bugs. There's also JAWS, which is a very popular screen reader user. I think it might also be Windows, but I'm not sure if it is platform specific. But that's a pretty expensive tool because it's something that people would be using every day pretty heavily. For Mac, we use VoiceOver, which is decent, but again, different tools will give you different results. There's also Chromevox, which is specifically for a browser for Chrome. not for a specific operating system. So if you wanted to do that, they have certain softwares and tools and extensions for that as well. So at Pixel, we kind of do a little bit of everything. We have some Mac users, some Windows users, some Linux users. I believe the screen reader for Linux is called Orca. That's that software. So it's also great to have like multiple people tested on multiple devices. So me personally, now that I'm on a Mac, I do use VoiceOver as my primary screen reader when I'm doing testing.
Awesome. And I think you just addressed his last question. An actual screen reader device or simulator or software or tool extension, you just ran through a bunch of them. So that
Mhm.
seems like a good answer for that. He also asked, how do you feel about the widgets that people add to site to address ADA issues? Are you familiar with any of those
Yeah, so
add-ons?
they have some of those add-ons where you can open up essentially an accessibility menu that's like, okay, do this to the text or make all the things work for dark mode or add additional information when it comes to like alt text. So I think the concept is decent. I think the execution needs a little help, but it's fairly new. I also know that there are extensions and tools that people have made to essentially cheat the system. So they can detect someone is using a tool to test this, and we're going to thwart that tool by temporarily adding some garbage alt text or fake ARIA labels so that it technically passes. Um, so I think it's kind of like one of those their heart's in the right place, but are they doing a good job question? You know?
It's so
Uh,
dark, I feel like. Like loopholing accessibility issues. Yeah.
oh, I don't mean the ones that are not the ones that are doing the mean bad thing, but the ones
Yeah.
that are creating the widgets to try to improve accessibility.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Their hearts are in the right place, but whether or not they do a good job, I feel it's almost similar. Like they will try their best to get rid of some of the issues, but AI in general is relatively new, and we at Pixo have been exploring AI when it comes to testing as well. And when it even comes to content creation, one of the biggest things would be not blindly accepting what AI gives to you. Oftentimes, AI is trained on a biased data set. So, for example, um, if I told AI to generate a picture of me, and I say, I am wearing glasses, I'm in a wheelchair, et cetera, et cetera. Um, I've seen this done in one of the AxCon talks. The pictures were all of this blonde girl, not in a wheelchair, not with any type of a assistive device, because it was trained on a bias set. So it's possible that the information that you would get from those tools might not even be very accurate. So anything that does that on the fly, I would say we're not there yet. Um, but when it comes to like creating content in the background, it can give you suggestions, but I would still recommend that a human looks at those suggestions and tweaks it for correctness and, et cetera. So I think they're going in a really good direction.
I'll just add on, I had
Yeah.
a widget type company reach out to us and say, hey, would you just prefer to do our plugin instead of going through all the steps to make your sites accessible? And I'm like, I don't think that's how we would ever operate. I don't think we would just add a widget on and be like, forget it, it's done. But I was looking at their website specifically, and it was a fee per month that they want on these websites to do it. Whereas Pixo might spend this extra time up front. You might spend the money to do it, but it would be accessible from from the get-go. So I don't know. I'm just curious in general too about that, Kurt. So if the widget thing is a real solution or a band-aid, I'm not sure yet.
Yeah, it feels very much like a Band-Aid over maybe a gaping wound that needs sutures. Or
Yeah.
it could be. Yeah.
As you were talking about AI, I got a push notification on my Apple Watch about try this new AI feature. So I'm like,
Ugh.
They're watching.
They're listening.
Like Kurt also put in the chat, AI added an alt tag of a hand with a syringe to a person holding a gun. That's exactly the kind of, thing that we want to do our due diligence with when using AI. But I think there is definitely a place for that. Yeah, I think so. ADA needs to be addressed in the code, not through a widget. Yep. But again, when it comes to accessible content creation, I think there's like a lot that AI can do. And even when it comes to maybe testing. So remember that slide that I had about you can't just hire hundreds of people with disabilities, but if we were able to train models about what the experience is like for different users with disabilities, we might get a richer data set back from running these tests to see what can we improve. That's our accessibility 909 talk. So
Yeah.
PhD.
Come back next time.
Well, I think we are all caught up. We do have a few minutes here still, though, so we will hang tight just to make sure any other questions don't come in. Yes, Kurt, the recording will be shared, so we'll get an email sent out before the end of the day today. It will include a recording of today's session, a link where you can go to view that. It'll also include all of the resources that were shared throughout the session and that Jenna was dropping in the chat, and then a copy of the presentation so you can actually go back and look through that. If you need to share it with anyone on your team or anything like that, you will have access to that. And I will, like I said, I'll be sending that out before the end of the day today. So you have it, if you want to get started first thing on it Monday morning or anything like that, you will have access to. So like I said, we'll hang tight here for another minute. I do want to thank everyone for joining us today. Yeah, no problem at all, Kurt. And thank you to the Pixo team for joining us. Always a ton of great information is shared. Be on the lookout for future sessions with them because like they said, these topics could be talked about for hours, days, so we will continue to provide you guys with information that is applicable for you and your business. So thank you everyone for joining us and thank you for presenting.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jordan.
Everyone.
All righty, well, I'm going to go ahead and wrap up today's session. Thank you everyone and have a great weekend.
Have a great weekend.
Bye.